Let's talk about post-production in D5 render. Post-production is the difference between a bad image and a beautiful image, and it's all controlled by the effect tab right over here. So I'm going to break down what all these settings do so you can create better renderings. Something that's important to understand about post-production, you can have the most beautiful materials or the most beautiful model. If you don't nail the post-production, the image is going to look bad. So these are default settings on this image. You can see things are overexposed, the saturation looks wrong, and it's not really bringing out all the beautiful details of the image. This is a color graded image and this looks so much better. There's no harsh highlights or anything. It looks correct. So I want to show you how to do this. So I'm going to go over to default and I'm going to break down what all these settings do. So starting from the top, the LUT, lookup table. If you have no idea what this impacts the image by so much. Think of these as Instagram filters. That's really the easiest way to explain it. You can basically click here and you can choose some of the default settings here. So I've got day or night, I've got modern dystopian, I can increase the intensity, and you could see all the different color changes. It's a very easy way to add some color, saturation, or desaturation to an image. But let's say you don't like the default ones, and I don't blame you. They're kind of weird. I actually don't know why you would use any of these. But anyways, let's say you want to use your own. How would you do that? If you go under Customize LUT, you can actually go and download some and load them in here. So for example, these guys right here, on one, they give out these great free LUT packages. Let me show you what that looks like in action. And that's one right there. It's a little extreme, so I'd lower the intensity, of course, right? That's kind of the benefit of this. You can actually choose how intense it is. But let's say you don't even like this guy's LUTs, right? You can go and make your own. It's actually really easy. In Photoshop, I've got this image here. If I were to add a bunch of different adjustment layers, let's say like a saturation boost layer, let me just boost this. You know, obviously I know this is extreme, but bear with me. If I were to just go to File, Export, and then color lookup table, and I save this as a cube file right here, and I hit OK, and let's just say this is a saturation boost. It's going to take that adjustment layer, this one, and apply it to my image. It's not going to take the color. So you see how my image is like very orange and blue? It's going to take this guy. It's going to take the saturation of plus 78. So watch this. If I go here, and then I find wherever I save that guy, it's going to add an insane amount of saturation. Look at that. Again, it's taking the adjustment layer. So this is kind of crazy because what this means is you can actually dial in your adjustment settings in Photoshop and export that as a LUT and then apply that to all of your renderings, and you've got a consistent style across them. This is also what the AI atmosphere match tool is kind of doing. Obviously it's doing some things with the HDRI and the sky and everything, but this is actually a big part of it. So you've got that. If you don't like the look of it, you could just uncheck it, and there you go. Easy way to check the difference. But generally speaking, you should probably have one. You should dial in some settings that you really like. This is going to save you some time. You can recreate this with like all these settings, but you know, if you want to save some time and a buck, this is the way to do it. So anyways, let me turn that off and let's move on to the next one. Exposure. If you watched my videos before, you know I am a stickler for this. Auto exposure gets you in trouble. Look at how bright my image is getting. If I move the camera around, the exposure is going to start changing to reflect the correct light limit of the new angle. The problem is it's a moving target. How can I dial this in if it's automatically changing? So always turn this off, and let me just go back to default. And generally speaking, when you lower it, you know, it's going to get darker. If you raise it, it's going to get brighter. My rule of thumb here, do not go past 0.1, okay? 0.1 in either direction. This is a very good amount of exposure. This is way too dark, right? This is a little too much. You get my point. 0.1, keep it subtle. You're going to hear me say subtle 100 times this video. Take a shot every time I say subtle, right? The reason being is everything we do should not be super intense or dramatic. It's going to mess up the balance of the image, okay? Balance is so important. So bear with me, keep it at 0.1. So you'll see here that I have it at 0.37 and this is no good. If I right click, it's actually going to zero out the setting. So don't feel like, oh, I'm scared to tweak my settings because I'll lose it. No, you could just right click. You can also just save a new scene. You know, you could update it here as well, and it will save each effect differently. So you can have one with an exposure of 0, another one with an exposure of 0.1. That's the beauty of the scenes. They're not stupid, they're intelligent. They actually save all this stuff. So anyways, moving on. Highlight local exposure and shadow local exposure. So I actually don't like the grouping of how D5 has this because these are local settings and these are macro settings, and you wouldn't really know it unless you nerd out and you do deep dives on like what tone mapping is and all that. So I'm gonna break it down. These guys, the highlights, it's really just going to affect kind of like your whites, if that makes sense. You see how anything that's light is getting brighter, but anything that's dark is getting darker. It's a little hard to explain, but 0, you can kind of see I'm clamping how bright it is, right? So it's taking any bright spot and it's letting me clamp it in a way. So let me do the same with shadows. You're going to see that the shadows are going to go from dark to light, okay? And it's just affecting the shadows here, right? The next one is contrast, and I'll get to what I mean about local versus macro in a second. But contrast, this is going to add a little bit of pop. If you go in the negative, you'll have gray. Anything negative is going to add this kind of grayness. Generally speaking, you know, don't go past 0.1, right? You know, a little theme there. You don't want to go too far. Again, it's going to look really weird. Like this looks burned. This doesn't look good. So what I was saying about the macro versus local, if I do highlight here, it's going to affect the highlights throughout my whole image, right? It's not just localized. So this, I generally don't go past 0.3. I think it does a good job with the default settings. Shadow, watch what happens. It darkens every single shadow, right? You see this? It's just the whole image is now being affected by this setting. And the slope is basically the contrast between the two of your lights and your darks. Okay, that's what this slope is. Okay, you see that? Generally speaking, I usually have my contrast handle this. I don't really boost this too much, but it's there for you if you need it. And then we have white balance. White balance, it could be used for 2 reasons. An easy way to just add color to a scene. Blue will make it colder. Orange, or to the right, will make it warmer, right? That's one way of doing it. The actual real reason people use white balance is, let's say you're doing an interior scene and you have a lot of warm orange lighting, right? And your gray walls are now turning beige because of all the yellow. White balance is going to correct that. So if you have a lot of warmness, you'd make it cooler to make the grays look more gray. So I'm going to right click that, and that'll make sense. You generally don't want to go too far. If you're going too far, that means your lighting is probably a little off. And that's true for the exposure settings too. Like if you're compensating a lot through here, go back to your environment settings, play with your HDRI or the sky, and boost the lighting intensity or not, or lessen it, you know? These are just like little sprinkles of magic on top. Like you're finalizing, you're closing the image up. This should not be doing a lot of the heavy lifting, okay? Heavy lifting is done on the environment side, not the effect side. All right, so I'm gonna right click, tint. I would only tint if I'm trying to do something stylized. Again, I don't wanna add these types of colors to my scene, but you do have the option there. Again, I've only used this for stylized projects. Now bloom, pay attention to this truck right here. If I increase this guy, you see how like the little highlights are glowing? That's what bloom's gonna do. This, maybe I catch a little flack here. It's a little stylistic. For those hardcore realistic render guys, this value is very low. For me, I like the bloom. I like the glow. I'm a sucker for bloom. I'll keep it at 0.2, 0.3. Again, totally subjective. You will kind of figure out what you like, but I like this. It helps the eye focus, and if you know what you're doing with it, it's actually a really powerful tool to get someone to look at something. So then lens flare, if I increase this, it adds a lens flare. It's trying to mimic a camera. In my opinion, this was like really big, like 10-15 years ago. You know, Michael Bay gets a lot of flack for his hardcore lens flaring. I think it's a little dramatic. I just keep it off. I think it looks a little gamey, a little gimmicky. For any gamers out there, you know what I'm talking about. You know, think of like any Battlefield game. You've got this all over the screen with like a dirt mask. It looks a little much. We want nice, clean images. I think it's distracting. Turn that off. Then rainbow flare. Rainbow flare, this is another one of those things. It's like, it's nice that it's here, but why would you ever use it? And I'll explain why in a second. Let me switch over to Geo and Sky, and let me just grab my sun right here. Okay, and I'll switch back to effect. Rainbow flare is just going to give us this little halo here. And if you can't see what I'm talking about, let me turn off the clouds. There we go. That halo is rainbow flare. It just mimics what it would look like outside. You know, again, one is super extreme. I think a little bit is cute. You know, this and that, it's a little extreme. You can kind of see it looks a little crazy. So again, this is one of those subjective things. You do what you feel is right. Personally, I'd probably keep a little bit of rainbow flare, and I'd turn off lens flare. So then vignette. If you don't know what vignette is, pay attention to the corners. It basically just adds darkness to help focus your view on the center, right? It's kind of like a shadow box on the outside. You want to add a little bit so the viewer isn't paying attention to the corners, because the corners is not interesting. It's the center or the focal point of your image that matters. So a little bit of vignette, again, helps the user focus. You don't want to go too much because this just looks weird. This is a little too stylized for me. Not a big fan of that. So I'm going to lower that just to there. Then there's chromatic aberration. This is one of those funny things. It's so basically, you know, you've got your red, green, and blue layer. And when a photo is taken, it's stitching those layers together. When aberration happens, it's basically a fringing. So notice the fringing of the layers. They're basically misaligned. And what's funny about it is, you know, very expensive like cameras in the world of like cinema do a great job removing this, right? And so in the 3D CGI world, it's like it's very easy for us to like add this imperfection, but the imperfection is what makes people think it's a photo. So it's kind of funny. It's like the real world people are trying to get rid of it, but we're trying to add it to mimic those cameras. It's a little funny, but again, a little bit. Don't add a lot. This is too much, right? Once it feels like you're getting like blurry and like you need a new prescription, you've gone too far. I think just a little bit, totally fine, because this is what would happen in the real world. Then there's saturation. So look at our greens and our colors of our blues here. If I go to the right, it's going to be super vibrant, super saturated. This, not a good look. It's way too saturated. I'm getting like this harsh yellow here. You just want it to be subtle. If you go reverse, it's going to be desaturated. So this is how you do a black and white image. Again, nothing wrong with this, but a little bit of saturation goes a long way. Again, subtle. You don't want to overdo it. All right, so then right down here under style, we have this thing called AO. And AO, I feel like, is not appreciated enough. AO is, in my opinion, a little pro tip to get a lot of realism in your scene. So if you don't know what AO is, it's ambient occlusion. It's just a fancy way of saying adding shadows to contacts and all these little nooks and crannies. So let me visualize it. I'll hit this, and this, basically anything that's dark or gray, is a shadow layer that's added on top of the final image. So pay attention to the details in the rim here, in the wheel here, under the car. If I play with the radius, it basically gets darker, like we're adding more and more. If I use AO overlay in preview, it's now adding that detail into the image, okay? It's not on by default. So if I turn it off, the image is gonna look brighter because I've cranked the radius so high. A little bit of AO is nice. It's gonna help add a lot of nice details. Traditionally, you would have to bake AO or ambient occlusion into the mesh. That's why you have a texture slot for it in our materials. This puts it on the whole image, which actually saves you a lot of time, so you don't have to do that. So again, very, very handy. Again, we want it to be subtle. 350 to 500 is totally fine. I always have this on to add a little bit of more detail. So then Z depth is the next one. Truthfully, this is one of those things, I'm not sure why it's really exposed, because this is how the engine understands depth. So this is like, when we're talking about like depth of field and everything, this is how it knows if something's close or not. And I'm trying to get the gradient in a correct manner. You can kind of see it flicker. Yeah, exactly. So black is far away, white is close. How's this helpful? It's really not. Maybe for you, if you're trying to understand the distance of your foreground, midground, background, maybe that's useful. I'm not rendering with this. Again, it completely transforms the view of my my image, and this could just be rendered out as a material channel. So I don't really need that. So I'm gonna turn that off. Then there's outline mode. So if you're doing something sketchy, you might want to use this. So let me go right over here. If I check outline mode, it's going to add a thin line over everything. The problem is, and maybe I make this white, you see how much like gunk it's added to the scene? And like, yes, you could lower this, and yes, you could lower the width, and you can change the width by distance. It's not really useful unless you are doing some sort of, sketchy kind of stylized thing. Personally, this stuff always makes me think of like Enscape, where like by default it's kind of got this look on it. I'm not a big fan of it. You can see like what it's adding. It's too much. Let me switch it to black. Like, in my opinion, this isn't even like usable because of how much black is on everything. So I turn that off. Might be useful if you're doing something conceptual, but in most cases I'm not, so I don't really have a purpose for this. Yeah, but you can control essentially the opacity here. Kind of see before and after. It's way too much at one. Yeah, look at that. But for architecture stuff, for highlighting some of these slats and everything, let me get in close. Is it nice? It's a little nice. But yeah, you can see there. I would not personally use this for my renderings. One last thing, we've got color grading here. If you don't have this on your screen, the reason is I actually have it enabled under preferences. You've got a widget tab. Anything beta related lives here, and this is the color grading tool. This you can totally avoid using it, but there's several things that it does do, which is actually really nice if you're kind of like really into color grading and like tweaking every single aspect of the image. Let me point these out. You've got a global controller, which adds almost like a tint to the whole image. You can reset everything with that little arrow, but more importantly, you can grade your shadows. So watch this. Let me make my shadows blue, just so you can see it. Let me make my midtones pink, so you could see midtones. And then let me do all my highlights as yellow. So it's kind of cool that you can adjust these. So in like a real world scenario, maybe my highlights are like a little warm, right? And my midtones are, keep it white, a little bit to the red or orange, because it's kind of like a warm scene. And then the shadows, I can kind of like play with them here and darken them to kind of give it that like summer beachy look, right? So this is a really nice way of doing that. And then it only took a couple clicks. So again, this kind of goes back to like a LUT and like a stylized aesthetic and everything. But my point is, it is there if you want to use it. You totally don't have to. And you can reset all with this button right here. So that's super useful. And then one last thing that I will add for post-production, although it doesn't live under effect, I feel like it should. Under camera, don't forget that you do have depth of field settings. So if you check mark this and you hit set focus, it'll automatically calibrate if something should be in focus or not. So if I zoom in here and I don't know, let me say I want to focus on the truck and I increase my focus, anything close to me is going to be blurred. Anything close to the truck will be in focus, right? So again, I point this out because I'm always using this in conjunction with my effect tab. And remember, once you do all this, you need to update your scene or all your work is going to disappear and you're going to be sad. But Anyways, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. If you have any questions, drop a comment. And if you made it this far, please think about subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out, and I love growing this community. Anyways, I'll see you next time.